The crunch of leaves behind me was my only warning before the world erupted into chaos. A blur of fur and muscle slammed into me, knocking the breath from my lungs as claws tore through fabric and flesh. The ground was cold and damp beneath me, but the heat of its snarling breath was all I could feel. My screams were swallowed by the forest, unheard and unanswered, as its massive jaws snapped inches from my face. Panic surged as I clawed at the dirt, desperately searching for any chance to escape. It wasn't hunting, it was destroying. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air as Tim and I trudged through the thick forest. Kodiak Island was a hunter's paradise, but its beauty masked an underlying tension, one I couldn't shake. At 50, I'd been hunting for over half my life, and I thought I'd seen it all until that trip. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of gold and green. I adjusted my pack and glanced at Tim. His broad shoulders moved steadily ahead of me, his rifle slung lazily over one shoulder. Tim was a few years younger than me, but his confidence in the wild sometimes bordered on arrogance. "Dale," he called back, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Keep up, old man. I want to cover a good stretch before lunch." I smirked, shaking my head. "Maybe if you stopped yammering, we'd have spotted some caribou by now." Tim laughed, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet forest. Spoken like someone who's spent too much time in the city lately. Anchorage isn't exactly the wilds, you know. I ignored the jab and tightened my grip on my rifle. Tim was right in a way. Life in Anchorage had softened me, and this trip was my way of reconnecting with the wilderness. But there was something different about the forest today. It wasn't the quiet. Forests were always quiet in a way that made your ears strain for sound. It was the absence of movement. No birds darted between the branches, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. "Do you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Tim glanced over his shoulder, raising an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Exactly." He shrugged and kept walking. "Relax, Dale. Probably just means there's something bigger in the area. We're in bear country after all." Bear country. The words hung in the air like a warning. Kodiak was home to some of the largest grizzlies on Earth, and while attacks were rare, the possibility was always there. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The only thing I saw was the sway of branches in the breeze. "Ever see a grizzly out here before?" I asked, falling into step beside Tim. "Once," he said. "Big guy, maybe 900 pounds. He wasn't interested in me, though just passed through." I nodded, trying to draw comfort from his words, but the unease lingered. We hiked in silence for a while, the trail winding deeper into the forest. Around mid-morning, we reached a clearing and decided to take a break. Tim dropped his pack and sat on a fallen log, pulling out a granola bar. "You're too jumpy, Dale," he said between bites. "You need to trust the woods more. Bears don't want anything to do with us unless we give them a reason." "Yeah. And what if we accidentally give them a reason?" I asked, sitting down beside him. Tim chuckled. "Then you've got that," he said, nodding to my rifle. "Though I doubt you'll need it." His nonchalance annoyed me, but I didn't argue. Instead, I took a sip from my water bottle and stared at the dense wall of trees surrounding the clearing. That prickle of unease was back, crawling up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Dale." Tim's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. He was pointing to the ground near the edge of the clearing. "Check this out." I stood and walked over to where he was crouching. In the dirt was a fresh track, massive and unmistakable. "Grizzly," I said, my throat tightening. "Looks like a big one, too," Tim added, his tone more curious than concerned. "Should we head back?" I asked, my voice lower now, as if the bear might overhear. Tim shook his head. "No need. The tracks are headed away from us. Besides, it's probably long gone by now." I wasn't so sure. The track looked fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp earth. But Tim was already moving again, his confidence pushing us forward. I followed reluctantly, my grip on my rifle tightening with each step. As we climbed a ridge, the wind shifted, carrying with it a musky, animal scent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Do you smell that?" I asked. Tim sniffed the air and shrugged. Probably just the bear marking its territory. "We're fine." I wanted to believe him, but every instinct screamed otherwise. The scent was too strong, too close. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the bear charging toward us. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. Tim must have sensed my unease because he stopped and turned to me. "Look, Dale, if you're that worried, we can set up camp early. Make a fire, keep watch. Bears don't like fire." "Fine," I said, my voice tight. "Let's do that." We found a spot near a cluster of large rocks that offered some protection. Tim started the fire while I gathered kindling, my eyes constantly scanning the shadows. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the fire was crackling steadily, casting flickering light across the campsite. "You know," Tim said, leaning back against a rock, "I think you're letting your imagination get the best of you. I've been out here dozens of times and never had a problem." "Maybe," I admitted, though I wasn't convinced. The fire's warmth was comforting, but it couldn't banish the sense of vulnerability that came with being in bear country. I sat with my back to the rock, my rifle across my lap, and tried to relax. Tim was already dozing, his head tilted back and his mouth slightly open. The forest felt alive around us, every rustle of leaves and crack of a branch amplified in the darkness. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. It was going to be a long night. As the fire crackled and the stars emerged overhead, I whispered to myself, "We're alone." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The morning broke gray and cold, the kind of light that filtered through the trees and cast long shadows on the forest floor. The fire had burned low during the night, reduced to glowing embers. I sat up slowly, every joint stiff, and glanced at Tim, who was still snoring softly. Despite my exhaustion, I hadn't slept much. My mind replayed every rustle and creak from the night, each one magnified into something more sinister. Tim stirred, muttering something incoherent as he sat up and rubbed his face. "Morning already?" he grumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," I said, poking at the ashes with a stick. "Barely." He yawned and stretched, then reached for the coffee pot we'd packed. "You're still wound up, huh?" I nodded, staring into the woods. "Didn't sleep much. Just had this feeling." Tim rolled his eyes, filling the pot with water. "You're gonna drive yourself crazy out here, Dale. It's the woods. It's supposed to feel like that. Relax." His nonchalance grated on me, but I let it slide. Instead, I stood and stretched, trying to shake the fatigue from my limbs. "We should check the area before we pack up," I said. "Just in case." Tim shrugged. "Fine. But I'm telling you, it's nothing." The forest felt different as we moved through it, the kind of heavy quiet that made your ears strain for sound. About 50 yards from the camp, Tim froze and crouched, gesturing for me to come closer. I crept up beside him, my stomach twisting as I saw what he was pointing at. In the soft mud near the edge of a stream was a fresh set of tracks, massive, unmistakable, and terrifyingly close. "Looks like it passed through during the night," Tim said, his voice low but calm. "Big one, too. You can tell by the size of the pads." "It came this close to camp?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Probably curious," Tim said, standing up. "Didn't hear us, moved on. No harm done." "No harm done?" I repeated, glaring at him. "Tim, it was right here." He sighed, brushing off his jeans. "Bears are like that, Dale. They wander. Doesn't mean it's coming back. Now, if we'd left food out, then we'd have a problem." I couldn't believe how casual he was about it. I knelt beside the tracks, my pulse quickening as I traced the edges of the massive paw print with my finger. The depth of the impression told me the bear was heavy, and the direction of the track suggested it had doubled back toward the ridge we'd come from the day before. "It's circling," I said, standing and brushing the dirt from my hands. "That's not normal, Tim." Tim adjusted his pack, his expression somewhere between patience and exasperation. "Bears are opportunistic, sure, but this one's just passing through. Trust me, we've got nothing to worry about." "I'm not so sure about that." Tim clapped a hand on my shoulder, grinning. "Relax, Dale, this is what we came for, right? The wilderness, the thrill. Let's not let a few paw prints ruin the trip. I wanted to argue, but the truth was, I didn't have the energy. Instead, I followed him as we packed up camp and moved deeper into the woods. The tracks stayed with me, though every step marked by an uneasy awareness of how vulnerable we really were out here. By mid-morning, the forest had come alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of small animals. It should have been comforting, but instead, it put me on edge. Every sound felt like a distraction, something to draw my attention away from the unseen danger lurking nearby. Tim stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Over there," he whispered, pointing through the trees. I squinted, following his gaze until I saw it. A flash of movement, too brief to identify but unmistakably large. My heart skipped a beat as I raised my rifle, scanning the underbrush. "Easy," Tim said, his voice steady. "It's probably a caribou. Stay quiet." We crept forward, stepping carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The movement came again, a shadow slipping between the trees, and my finger tightened on the trigger. Then the shadow disappeared. "Did you see it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Tim nodded. "Yeah, but it's gone now. Let's keep moving." As we pushed deeper into the woods, the trail became harder to follow. The ground was rocky and uneven, and the thick undergrowth made every step a challenge. My unease grew with each passing minute, the forest pressing in around us like a living thing. Then we found the second set of tracks. They were fresher than the first, the mud still damp around the edges. The direction they led was unmistakable, straight toward the clearing we were heading for. "Tim," I said, my voice tight, "this isn't right." He crouched again, studying the tracks with the same calm detachment that made me want to shake him. "Huh. Looks like it's been following the same trail we have." "That's not comforting." "It's normal, Dale. Bears follow trails. They're lazy. They take the path of least resistance, just like us. Except we're not 900 pounds of muscle with claws." Tim smirked. "Fair point." I wasn't in the mood for jokes. The tracks weren't just following the trail, they were erratic, zigzagging in a way that made my skin crawl. It was as if the bear was searching for something, or someone. "We should turn back," I said firmly. "This isn't safe." Tim stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "We'll be fine. Let's just keep an eye out and stick together. We'll make camp early again if it makes you feel better." I opened my mouth to argue, but a sound stopped me cold, a low, guttural grunt that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My heart slammed against my ribs as I spun, searching the trees for movement. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Tim nodded slowly, his face finally showing a flicker of concern. "Yeah. Stay close." We moved quickly after that, every nerve on edge. The grunt didn't come again, but the forest felt heavier, more oppressive. When we finally reached a small stream, Tim suggested we stop for lunch. "I don't know if we should stay here," I said, scanning the tree line. "The tracks—" "Dale," Tim interrupted, his tone firm. "We've been careful. Let's take a break, eat something, and keep moving. Worrying yourself sick won't help." I wanted to argue, but I was too tired. I sat down on a rock and pulled out a granola bar, my rifle resting across my lap. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, every sound amplified and unnatural. "You think it's still out there?" I asked after a long silence. Tim shrugged, chewing his food. "Probably, but like I said, bears don't want anything to do with us unless we give them a reason." I nodded, but I didn't feel reassured. Something about the tracks, the grunt, the oppressive silence. It all felt wrong, and deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The forest air felt colder than it should have for early afternoon, a damp chill that sank into my bones. The sunlight, once comforting, now seemed weak and watery, casting long, jagged shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Tim and I had moved quickly after our break, driven more by an unspoken sense of urgency than any clear plan. Tim's voice broke the uneasy silence. "We'll cut through this ridge and circle back toward the trail. Should save us a couple of hours." "You sure about that?" I asked, scanning the dense trees ahead. "Feels like we're walking into a trap." "Trap?" Tim turned and shot me a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dale, it's a bear, not a mastermind. Relax. His cavalier tone grated on me, but before I could respond, the forest erupted in chaos. It happened so fast that, for a moment, I thought the ground had come alive and swallowed me whole. 1 second, I was following Tim, rifle in hand. The next, an unbearable weight slammed into my back, driving me face first into the dirt. A roar, low, guttural, and impossibly loud, rattled my skull. Pain bloomed across my shoulder and side as claws raked through my jacket like it was paper. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was flail uselessly as the world spun. "Tim!" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the bear's snarls. "Dale!" Tim's shout came from somewhere ahead, but it felt miles away. I twisted, trying to see what had me pinned. My blood ran cold at the sight of the grizzly, a massive wall of fur, teeth and claws. Its eyes, dark and unblinking, locked onto mine as it opened its jaws and sank its teeth into my shoulder. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever felt, sharp and hot and all-consuming. I screamed, my voice raw and desperate, as the bear dragged me backward through the underbrush. Dirt and leaves scraped against my face, mixing with the blood that was already pooling around me. "Tim, help me!" I screamed again, kicking wildly, trying to break free. The bear growled, its massive paw pressing into my chest. I could feel the power behind it, the sheer weight of the creature, and I knew I didn't stand a chance. My rifle was gone, ripped from my grasp in the initial attack. All I had were my hands, clawing at the ground, at the bear's fur, at anything that might give me leverage. Then came the crack of a rifle shot, splitting the air like thunder. The bear froze, its head snapping up. For a moment I thought it might run, but instead it turned toward the sound, its lips curling back in a snarl. "Get off him!" Tim shouted, his voice closer now. Another shot rang out, and this time the bear hesitated. It released me, its massive frame shifting as it rose onto its hind legs. I scrambled backward, clutching my bleeding shoulder, my vision swimming. Tim appeared through the trees, his rifle raised. He fired again, the shot echoing through the forest. The bear growled, the sound vibrating in my chest. But then it dropped back onto all fours and loped into the shadows. Tim rushed to my side, dropping his rifle as he knelt beside me. "Dale, you're alive," he said, his voice shaky but filled with relief. "Holy hell, you're alive." "Barely," I gasped, wincing as pain radiated from my shoulder. Blood soaked through my jacket, pooling around me in the dirt. "Let me see," Tim said, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. He cut through the shredded fabric, revealing the torn flesh beneath. His face paled. "Damn it, Dale. We've got to stop the bleeding." I nodded, too weak to argue. Tim worked quickly, using a strip of cloth from his pack to create a makeshift bandage. His hands trembled as he tied it off, his movements clumsy but desperate. "You're going to be okay," he said, more to himself than to me. "We just need to get you back to the truck." I laughed weakly, the sound turning into a cough. Easier said than done. Tim glanced around, his jaw tight. "I'll carry you if I have to, but we've got to move. That bear might come back." The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through me, overriding the pain for a moment. I nodded again, gritting my teeth as Tim helped me to my feet. Every step was agony, my shoulder burning and my ribs aching from the bear's claws. But I forced myself to keep going, knowing that stopping wasn't an option. The forest seemed to close in around us as we made our way back toward the trail. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made my heart race. I kept expecting the bear to burst through the trees again, its massive form blotting out the light. "Tim," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you think it's following us?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but we're not stopping to find out." As if in response, a low growl echoed through the woods. It was distant, but it stopped us both in our tracks. Tim's grip on my arm tightened, and I saw his eyes dart to the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Keep moving," he said, his voice firm. "We're almost there." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. Every step felt like it could be my last, the weight of the forest pressing down on me. My vision blurred, and I stumbled, nearly pulling Tim down with me. "Dale, stay with me," he said, his tone sharp. "We're not stopping here." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through the trees and onto the trail. The sight of the familiar path brought a flicker of relief, though it was short-lived. Tim glanced back toward the woods, his rifle raised. "I don't see it," he said. "Maybe we scared it off for good." I wanted to believe him, but the memory of the bear's eyes, cold, dark, and unrelenting, was burned into my mind. I doubted anything could scare a creature like that. "Let's just keep going," I said, my voice hoarse. "I don't want to find out." Tim nodded, and we pressed on, the forest growing quieter with each step. When we finally reached the truck, I collapsed against the side, my body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Tim loaded me into the passenger seat, his movements quick but careful. "We're getting you to the hospital," he said, starting the engine. "Just hold on." As the truck rumbled to life, I glanced back toward the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving between the trees, too large to be anything but the bear. But then it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The grizzly had left me alive, but I knew it wasn't out of mercy. It had simply decided I wasn't worth the effort, and that thought was almost more terrifying than the attack itself. The truck bounced along the uneven dirt road, the tires crunching over loose gravel and fallen branches. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of pain radiating through my shoulder and ribs, and I clenched my teeth to keep from groaning. Tim's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a hard line as he focused on the narrow road ahead. "You hanging in there, Dale?" he asked, his voice tight. "Barely," I managed to rasp. My throat felt dry and my body was trembling, not just from the blood loss, but from the memory of the grizzly's teeth sinking into my flesh. "How far to the nearest hospital?" "Hour, maybe less," Tim said. He glanced at me, worry flickering in his eyes. "We'll make it." I wasn't so sure. The pain was relentless, each shallow breath a reminder of how close I'd come to being killed. I leaned my head back against the seat, staring out the window as the forest blurred past. Shadows played tricks on my mind, every dark shape morphing into the massive form of the bear. The truck swerved slightly as Tim navigated a sharp bend, the back tires skidding on loose dirt. He cursed under his breath, then shot another glance at me. "Stay awake, okay? Talk to me." "About what?" I muttered, my voice weaker than I wanted it to be. "Anything," Tim said. "Just keep talking. Don't pass out on me." I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept circling back to the attack. "It was stalking us," I said finally. "All day it was watching us, waiting." "Bears don't stalk people," Tim replied quickly, too quickly. "It was probably just curious, following the same trail we were on." "Curious?" I laughed bitterly, the sound turning into a wince as pain shot through my ribs. "That thing wasn't curious, it wanted me dead." Tim didn't respond. The tension in the cab was thick, unspoken fears hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I wanted to press him, to make him admit that he'd underestimated the danger, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I let the hum of the engine fill the silence. The truck jolted suddenly and Tim pulled over onto the shoulder. "I need to check your bandages," he said, jumping out and coming around to my side. He opened the door, his face a mask of determination as he examined the makeshift dressing he'd wrapped around my shoulder back in the woods. "Dale," he said quietly, "this isn't holding. You're still bleeding." I glanced down and saw the dark red stain spreading across the fabric. The sight made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Do what you have to." Tim grabbed the first aid kit from the back seat and began working quickly. His hands were steady, but his face was pale. "I'm going to tighten this tourniquet," he said. "It's going to hurt." "It already hurts," I muttered, gripping the seat as he tightened the cloth. White-hot pain lanced through my arm, and I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. "You're doing good," Tim said, though his voice betrayed his own fear. "We'll get you patched up for now. Just a little longer." "Tim," I said through gritted teeth, "what if it comes back?" He paused for a fraction of a second before continuing. "It won't," he said firmly. That last shot scared it off. Bears don't take risks like that. "Yeah," I whispered, though I wasn't convinced. "Sure." The bandages held for the moment, but I could feel my strength slipping as the truck roared back to life. The forest grew thinner as we approached the edge of the wilderness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was still out there, watching, waiting. You think they'll believe us? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Who? Tim said, not taking his eyes off the road. The Rangers, the hospital, anyone. I shifted slightly, wincing as the movement jarred my injuries. Do you think they'll believe a grizzly attacked us? They'll believe the scars on your shoulder, Tim said grimly. They'll believe the blood. And then what? I pressed. What happens to the bear? Nothing, Tim admitted after a long pause. Unless it comes after someone else, they'll just file a report and move on. The thought made my stomach turn. That bear was still out there somewhere in the vast wilderness. A living reminder of how fragile the line between survival and death could be. It didn't seem fair, but I knew Tim was right. The forest was the bear's domain, not ours. When we finally pulled into the gravel lot of the small hospital, the sight of the building was almost surreal. Tim rushed inside to get help while I stayed slumped in the truck, too weak to move. Minutes later, a pair of nurses appeared, their faces a mixture of concern and professionalism as they helped me onto a stretcher. What happened? One of them asked as they wheeled me inside. Grizzly, I managed to say before the bright lights of the ER made me squeeze my eyes shut. The next hour was a blur of antiseptic smells and sharp pain as the doctors worked to clean and stitch my wounds. I drifted in and out of consciousness, snippets of conversation filtering through the haze. He's lucky to be alive, one of them said. If that bear had dragged him much further, do we notify Fish and Game? Another voice asked. Tim answered before I could. Already did. They said they'll investigate, but they don't usually hunt bears unless there's another incident. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to protest, to demand they do something, but exhaustion pulled me under before I could speak. When I woke, the room was dim, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. My shoulder was heavily bandaged and my ribs felt like they were encased in cement. Tim was sitting in a chair near the bed, his head resting in his hands. Hey, I croaked, my voice barely audible. Tim looked up, relief flooding his face. You're awake. Barely, I said, forcing a weak smile. What did the doctor say? You're going to be okay, Tim said. They cleaned the wounds, stitched you up. Said you'll need some time to heal, but you'll pull through. And the bear? Tim hesitated, then shrugged. They'll file the report, but like I said, nothing's going to happen unless it attacks someone else. I nodded slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. The scars on my body would heal, but the memory of the attack, the sound of the bear's growl, the weight of its claws, would stay with me forever. You saved my life, I said, meeting Tim's gaze. Thank you. He nodded, his expression serious. You would have done the same. As the night deepened, we sat in silence, the hospital room a stark contrast to the wilderness we'd left behind. The bear was still out there, a shadow in the trees, but for now I was alive, and that was enough. The drive home from the hospital was quiet. Tim had insisted on staying in Anchorage for a few days to make sure I was okay, but now we were back on the road, heading toward my place. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement was soothing, but my thoughts were anything but. I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. The wilderness was beautiful. Rolling hills, dense pine forests, the occasional flash of a stream winding through the trees, but I couldn't look at it the same way anymore. Every shadow felt like it could hide a grizzly, every dark patch of forest a reminder of how close I'd come to dying. Tim broke the silence first. You've been quiet since we left the hospital. I shrugged with my good shoulder, wincing at the movement. Not much to say. He glanced at me, his brow furrowed. Come on, Dale. Talk to me. You've been through hell. It's normal to feel messed up about it. Messed up? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Tim, I was nearly killed by a bear. I can still feel its claws, its teeth. Every time I close my eyes, it's there. How am I supposed to feel? Tim didn't respond right away. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and for a moment, the only sound was the rush of wind against the truck. Finally, he said, You're alive. That's what matters. Barely, I muttered, turning my gaze back to the window. When we finally pulled into my driveway, Tim helped me out of the truck. I leaned heavily on him, my legs unsteady. the pain in my ribs flaring with every step. Inside, the house felt strange, too quiet, too sterile. It was a far cry from the raw, unfiltered chaos of the wilderness. "You want me to stay a while?" Tim asked, setting my bag down near the couch. I shook my head. "I'll be fine." Tim looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't push. Instead, he gave my shoulder a careful pat and said, "Call me if you need anything." After he left, the silence was deafening. I sat on the couch, staring at the floor, my mind replaying the attack in vivid detail. The sound of the bear's growl, the feel of its claws tearing into my flesh, the way it had dragged me like I weighed nothing. It was all too real. A week passed, and I tried to settle back into a routine, but nothing felt normal. Every noise outside made me jump. Every walk through the woods near my property was a test of nerves. I started sleeping with my rifle beside the bed, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference if the bear decided to come back. One afternoon, I decided to visit the local Fish and Game office to follow up on the report Tim had filed. The ranger behind the desk, a middle-aged man named Barry, greeted me with a polite but distant smile. "Mr. Morgan," he said, glancing at my bandaged shoulder. "Good to see you up and about. Heard about the incident, hell of a thing." "Yeah," I said, sitting down across from him. "That's one way to put it." Barry leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "What can I do for you? I wanted to know if there's been any follow-up. On the bear, I mean." He sighed, his expression turning apologetic. "Not much we can do, to be honest. Unless it shows signs of aggression again, comes into town, attacks someone else, there's no justification for tracking it down." "So, it just gets to roam free?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "That bear nearly killed me." "I get that," Barry said, his tone calm but firm. "But this is its territory. It's not like it came into your backyard, you went into its." His words stung, even though I knew he was right. I'd gone into the wilderness willingly, knowing the risks. But that didn't make the fear or the anger any easier to deal with. "I just don't want it to happen to someone else," I said finally. "We'll keep an eye out," Barry promised. But like I said, unless it causes more trouble, our hands are tied. I left the office feeling hollow. The scars on my body were proof of what had happened, but they didn't seem to matter to anyone but me. The bear was still out there somewhere, and there was nothing I could do about it. Back home, I tried to distract myself by working on small projects around the house, but my thoughts always drifted back to the woods. I couldn't stop picturing the bear, couldn't stop hearing its growl. The nightmares came almost every night, leaving me drenched in sweat and gasping for air. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, I stepped outside to watch the sky. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that used to bring me peace. But now, it just felt oppressive. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the bear watching me from the shadows. "You're not out there," I muttered to myself. "Not here." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Weeks turned into months, and though the physical wounds healed, the memories lingered. People in town would ask me about the attack, their voices a mix of curiosity and disbelief. I told them what happened, but it always felt like I was telling someone else's story. The bear was real, the scars were real, but the world around me had moved on, leaving me stuck in that moment. One night, Tim stopped by unannounced, a six-pack of beer in hand. We sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around us as we drank in silence. "You ever think about going back out there?" he asked suddenly. "To the woods?" I shook my head. "Not yet." "You will," Tim said, his voice quiet but certain. "You love it too much to stay away." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could. When Tim left, I sat on the porch for a long time, staring at the dark line of trees in the distance. The forest had given me so much over the years: peace, adventure, a sense of connection to something bigger than myself. But it had also taken something I wasn't sure I could get back. The bear was still out there, somewhere, a part of the wilderness that I'd once loved. It hadn't cared about me, hadn't attacked out of malice or cruelty. It had simply been doing what it was born to do, and that, I realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. The sterile smell of the hospital lingered with me for days after I was discharged. It clung to my clothes, to my skin, even as I sat in the comfort of my home. The bandages on my shoulder and side were a constant reminder of what had happened. Tight and restrictive, their itchiness a cruel distraction from the throbbing pain beneath. The doctor said I was lucky. Another inch, one had remarked during my final checkup, and the bite would have crushed your collarbone. You wouldn't be walking out of here. I'd nodded at the time, grateful to be alive, but the word lucky felt hollow. Surviving didn't feel like luck, it felt like a scar I would carry forever. The first few days back home, I avoided looking at my reflection. When I finally forced myself to stand in front of the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back. My face was pale, my eyes sunken with exhaustion. The fresh stitches on my shoulder looked jagged and raw, and the bruises along my ribs had darkened into angry purples and greens. "You're alive," I muttered to my reflection, trying to convince myself. "You're alive, and that's what matters." But the words didn't sink in. The first real test came when I decided to share my story with a local hunting group. Tim had suggested it, saying it might help me process everything, but as I stood in front of the small crowd in the back room of the town's diner, I wasn't so sure. My voice faltered as the group stared back at me, their faces a mix of curiosity and quiet respect. I cleared my throat, gripping the edge of the podium like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I wanted to talk about what happened out on Kodiak, about the bear. There were murmurs of interest, and I caught a few nods. Most of the people in the room were experienced hunters, men and women who knew the risks of venturing into bear country, but they hadn't lived through what I had. "It was a grizzly," I began, my voice steadier now. "Big, maybe 800-900 pounds. It attacked me from behind, dragged me several feet before Tim managed to scare it off." A man in the front row raised his hand. "Did you see it coming at all?" "No," I admitted. "That's the thing, it was quiet, like a shadow. One second I was walking, the next, I gestured to my bandaged shoulder. It was on me." Another voice chimed in. "Was it aggressive?" "I mean, grizzlies don't usually attack unless they feel threatened." "It wasn't provoked," I said firmly. "We didn't see it before the attack, it came out of nowhere." The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling over the group. After a moment, one of the older hunters leaned forward. "You're lucky to be alive." There it was again, lucky. I nodded, though the word still felt wrong. "Yeah, I guess I am." When the meeting ended, a few people approached me to offer their sympathies or share their own close calls with bears. Their stories were harrowing, but none of them seemed to match the sheer brutality of what I'd experienced. As I shook hands and exchanged polite words, I couldn't help but feel a lingering disconnect. No one could truly understand what it had been like to stare into the eyes of a creature that saw me as nothing more than prey. At home, the nightmares began. Every night, I relived the attack, the roar, the crushing weight of the bear on my back, the searing pain of its claws and teeth. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the phantom pain in my shoulder so vivid it felt real. One night I woke with a start, my chest heaving. The room was dark, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For a moment I could have sworn I heard the bear's growl, low and guttural, echoing through the walls, echoing. I sat up, clutching my rifle, and scanned the shadows of the room. It took me nearly an hour to calm down, and even then sleep didn't come. The local rangers had promised to monitor the area where the attack happened, but I hadn't heard anything since filing the report. Frustrated, I called the Fish and Game office to follow up. "Mr. Morgan?" The ranger on the other end said, his voice polite but distant. "We haven't had any further reports of aggressive bear behavior in the area." "That doesn't mean it's not out there," I snapped, the frustration bubbling over. "What if it attacks someone else?" "I understand your concern," he said, his tone calm. "But unless there's another incident, we can't justify tracking or relocating the bear. It's part of the ecosystem out there, and encounters like this, while rare, are a natural risk." Natural risk. The phrase stung, even though I knew it was true. The bear wasn't evil. It was doing what bears do. But that knowledge didn't make the fear any easier to live with. A few weeks after the attack, Tim stopped by unannounced. He brought a case of beer and a bag of takeout, dropping them on the kitchen counter with a grin. Figured you could use some company. I smirked, though it felt forced. You're not wrong. We sat on the porch sipping our beers and watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the kind of stillness that used to bring me peace. Now it just felt heavy. You've been keeping to yourself, Tim said after a while, breaking the silence. Can you blame me? I replied, taking a long sip. Every time I close my eyes, I see that damn bear. It's like it's still out there waiting. It probably is, Tim said, his tone matter-of-fact. But it's not after you, Dale. You're not prey anymore. I glanced at him, surprised by his bluntness. What's that supposed to mean? It means you survived, he said simply. You faced it and you're still here. That's more than most people can say. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I looked out at the tree line, the shadows deepening as the night settled in. The bear was still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness. It didn't care about me, didn't remember the encounter, but I would never forget. You think I'll ever be able to go back out there? I asked quietly. Tim didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm. Yeah, you will. The woods are part of you, Dale. They always have been. This doesn't change that. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. The forest used to feel like home, a place of peace and adventure. Now it felt like a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. As the stars emerged overhead, I sat in silence, my thoughts tangled in fear and longing. I didn't know if I'd ever step foot in the woods again, but one thing was certain. The scars on my body would fade, but the memory of the bear would stay with me forever. The forest had always called to me, but now its voice was tinged with menace. The trees outside my window stood tall and silent, their shadows stretching long in the fading light of the day. I used to find comfort in their presence, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting to swallow me whole. Weeks had passed since the attack, and though my wounds were healing, the scars ran deeper than skin. I tried to fill my days with distractions, reading, tinkering in the garage, even cleaning the house from top to bottom, but nothing silenced the memories. The roar of the grizzly, the weight of its claws, the way it dragged me as if I were nothing more than a rag doll. It haunted me, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Tim stopped by one afternoon, a pair of coffees in hand. He let himself in, setting the cups on the counter before pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. You've been cooped up too long, Dale, he said, taking a sip of his coffee. You need to get out. I shook my head, leaning against the counter. I'm not ready. You're never going to feel ready, Tim countered, his tone gentle but firm. But sitting here, letting it eat away at you, that's not living, man. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. What am I supposed to do, Tim? Just walk back into the woods like nothing happened? Not like nothing happened, he said. But maybe you start small. A walk around the property. A drive to the edge of the forest, just something. I didn't answer. The idea of stepping into the woods again made my stomach churn. But Tim wasn't wrong. I couldn't hide forever. That evening, I stood at the edge of my yard, staring into the tree line. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The woods looked peaceful, almost inviting, but I knew better. They were full of secrets, of dangers lurking just out of sight. I took a tentative step forward, then another. My heart raced as I approached the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot louder than it should have been. When I reached the first line of pines, I stopped, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The memory of the grizzly surged to the surface, and for a moment, I could almost feel its claws digging into my shoulder again. Not today, I whispered, turning back toward the house. My legs felt like jelly, but I made it inside and locked the door behind me, my chest heaving with relief. The next day, I forced myself to attend a meeting of the local hunting group. Tim had told me they were interested in hearing more about my experience. And while the idea of reliving the attack in front of a crowd made me uneasy, I knew it might help. The room was small and crowded, filled with familiar faces. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the front, gripping the edge of the podium to steady myself. I've been hunting for over 30 years, I began, my voice shaky but steadying as I went on. I've always respected the wilderness, respected the animals that live in it. But nothing prepares you for the moment you're on the wrong side of that equation. The group listened intently as I recounted the attack, the details pouring out of me in a rush. I told them about the bear's size, its strength, the way it had dragged me as if I were weightless. I described the fear, the pain, the helplessness. When I finished, the room was silent. Finally, an older man in the back spoke up. "You're lucky to be alive." There was that word again. Lucky. I nodded, though the word felt wrong. I know, and I'm grateful. But it's not just about surviving, it's about what comes after. "What do you mean?" someone else asked. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "The forest used to feel like home," I said finally. "Now it feels like a place I don't belong. I'm trying to find my way back, but it's hard." There were murmurs of understanding, and a few people approached me after the meeting to share their own experiences with close calls in the wild. Their stories were harrowing, but none of them matched the sheer brutality of what I'd been through. Still, it was comforting to know I wasn't alone. One morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong outside my window. It was a sound I hadn't noticed in weeks, and for a moment it filled me with a strange sense of hope. I got dressed, grabbed my coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The woods stretched out before me, quiet and still. I knew the bear was out there somewhere, a part of this vast wilderness that I'd once loved. It didn't care about me, didn't remember our encounter. It was just living its life, following its instincts. I took a deep breath and walked to the edge of the yard. The trees loomed ahead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. My heart raced as I took a step forward, then another. This time, I didn't stop. I walked into the woods, the crunch of leaves underfoot steadying me as I went. The forest felt different now, both familiar and foreign. The sounds of birds, the rustle of leaves, the scent of pine, they were all the same as before, but they carried a weight they hadn't before. I kept walking, one step at a time, until I reached a small clearing. I stood there for a long time, staring at the trees, listening to the sounds of the forest. My heart was still racing, but there was something else now too, something I hadn't felt since the attack, a sense of connection, of belonging. The bear had taken something from me, but it hadn't taken everything. The forest was still here, still wild and untamed, and I was still a part of it. I turned and started back toward the house, the weight on my chest a little lighter than it had been before. When I reached the yard, I glanced back at the woods one last time. They were quiet now, the shadows deepening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. The forest hadn't given up on me, and maybe, just maybe, I hadn't given up on it either. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long streaks of gold onto the forest floor. For the first time in months, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods with my rifle slung over my shoulder. My breath puffed in the cold air as I stared into the shadows of the trees. My heart a strange mix of dread and determination. Tim had dropped by earlier, offering to come with me, but I'd declined. This was something I needed to do alone. The forest had taken so much from me, but it had also been my sanctuary for years. I couldn't let fear strip it away entirely. "All right," I muttered under my breath, gripping the rifle a little tighter, one step at a time. The first few hundred yards were the hardest. Every creak of the branches, every rustle of the underbrush sent my pulse racing. My boots crunched on the thin layer of frost covering the fallen leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I scanned the trees constantly, my grip on the rifle firm but not quite steady. I wasn't hunting. Not really. The rifle was more a security blanket than a weapon. This trip wasn't about taking game. It was about reclaiming something I'd lost. Still, I couldn't ignore the tension in my muscles, the way my body braced itself as if expecting another attack at any moment. As I walked, the forest began to feel a little more familiar. The smell of damp earth, the sound of distant bird calls, the sight of sunlight breaking through the canopy. All of it was the same as it had always been. But there was something else, too, a weight that hung in the air, a reminder of how close I'd come to never walking this trail again. I stopped at a small clearing, the same one where Tim and I had camped that night. The fire ring we'd built was still there. The the stones blackened with soot. I crouched down, running my hand over one of the rocks, memories flooding back. "You still out there?" I said quietly, as if the bear might answer. The sound of a twig snapping behind me froze me in place. My heart jumped into my throat as I spun around, the rifle coming up instinctively. My finger hovered over the trigger as I scanned the trees, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Nothing. The forest was silent, the stillness almost oppressive. I lowered the rifle slowly, my hands trembling. It could have been anything, a deer, a branch falling, even just the wind. But the adrenaline coursing through me didn't care about logic. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head. "It's just the woods." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I pressed on, my steps cautious but deliberate. The deeper I went, the more the forest began to feel like itself again. The fear was still there, lurking at the edges of my mind, but it wasn't all-consuming. I focused on the familiar rhythms of the wilderness, the way the light shifted through the branches, the sound of a squirrel skittering up a tree, the faint babble of a distant creek. It was almost enough to make me forget why I'd been so afraid in the first place. Almost. I came to a ridge overlooking a valley, the view breathtaking in the midday light. The forest stretched out for miles, an endless sea of green and gold. I sat down on a fallen log, letting the rifle rest across my knees, and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The bear was still out there, I knew that, but it wasn't here. And for now, that was enough. The sound of movement below the ridge snapped me out of my thoughts. I tensed, my eyes scanning the valley floor. A shadow moved between the trees, large and unmistakable. The bear. My stomach clenched as I watched it amble through the underbrush, its massive form both terrifying and awe-inspiring. It wasn't close, not close enough to be a threat, but seeing it again was enough to bring back every ounce of fear I'd been trying to bury. I raised the rifle slowly, my hands steady now. I lined up the sights, my finger brushing the trigger. The bear paused, lifting its head as if it sensed my presence. It turned slightly, giving me a clear shot, but I didn't take it. Instead, I lowered the rifle and watched as the bear moved on, disappearing into the shadows. It hadn't seen me, hadn't cared about me. It was just living. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I made my way back toward the edge of the forest. The encounter with the bear had left me shaken but also strangely calm. I'd faced it, not directly, but enough to feel like I'd taken a step forward. The bear wasn't my enemy. It wasn't something to conquer or fear. It was a part of this place just like I was. When I reached the tree line, I paused, looking back at the woods. The shadows were longer now, the light fading into twilight. The forest was still wild, still dangerous, but it didn't feel quite as hostile anymore. "See you around?" I said softly, my words carried away by the breeze. Back at home, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars come out one by one. The woods were a dark silhouette against the sky, quiet and still. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the need to keep the rifle within arm's reach. Tim's words from weeks ago came back to me. "The woods are part of you, Dale. They always have been. This doesn't change that." He was right. The forest had been my refuge for years, a place where I felt connected to something larger than myself. The bear hadn't taken that away from me. If anything, it had reminded me of the fragility of that connection, of how easily it could be lost. As I finished my coffee, a sense of resolve settled over me. The scars on my shoulder and ribs would always be there, but they didn't define me. The bear was out there somewhere, a part of this wild, untamed place. And so was I. The forest had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could keep walking, one step at a time. And this was a report. Before we go to the next one, leave your opinion in the comments. We would love to know. Now let's move on to the next one. The drive to Great Smoky Mountains National Park had been uneventful, but as I pulled into the campsite parking lot, the air seemed charged with something different. I stepped out of my old Subaru and stretched, the cool mountain air filling my lungs. It smelled of earth and pine, so clean it was almost disorienting. Birds called somewhere in the canopy above, and I could hear the faint rush of a creek nearby. "This is going to be great," I muttered to myself, glancing at the line of trees bordering the parking lot. The woods felt inviting, a vast green cathedral waiting to be explored. I couldn't shake the feeling, though that I was being watched. Shaking it off, I grabbed my bag from the trunk and hoisted it over my shoulder. "Hey Tina, over here." My friend Jamie waved from where she was unloading gear from her truck. Her curly hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she was already sweating in the June heat. "Coming," I called back, weaving between parked cars. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks. Jamie, her boyfriend Mike, and I had all managed to snag a weekend off at the same time, a small miracle given our conflicting schedules. They were seasoned campers. I wasn't, but I was determined to prove I could handle a weekend in the wilderness without Wi-Fi or running water. "You're late," Mike teased, tossing a bundle of firewood into a nearby pile. He was tall and wiry, with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow that made him look older than his 30 years. "Blame Nashville traffic," I said, rolling my eyes. "Anyway, I brought the snacks, you're welcome." "Good," Jamie said. "Jamie, you're on s'mores duty tonight." As we carried our gear to the campsite, we passed the ranger station. A middle-aged ranger with a friendly but weary expression stepped out, clipboard in hand. He greeted us with a smile. "Y'all staying the weekend?" he asked, eyeing our backpacks and coolers. "Yep, Site 27, Jamie said. The ranger nodded and handed us a pamphlet. "Just a few things to keep in mind. We've had reports of increased bear activity in the area. Make sure you use the food lockers at your site and keep your campsite clean. No food in the tents, got it?" "Got it," Jamie said, already folding the pamphlet in half. I glanced at the title, Bear Safety Tips. The image of a black bear printed on the cover didn't look particularly threatening. "Are there usually bears around here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The ranger shrugged. "It's their home. They're curious, not aggressive, as long as you don't give them a reason to be. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." I nodded, though a small shiver ran down my spine. The hike to the campsite was short, less than half a mile. The path wound through towering oaks and maples, their leaves filtering the sunlight into a soft green glow. When we reached the site, I couldn't help but grin. It was perfect. A clearing surrounded by trees with a fire ring in the center and a sturdy picnic table off to the side. Jamie and Mike immediately got to work setting up the tents, while I unloaded the cooler and organized our food supplies. "Hey, Tina," Jamie called. "Want to help with the rainfly? Or are you planning to supervise all weekend?" "Supervising sounds good," I shot back, earning a laugh from Mike. By late afternoon, we'd settled in. The tents were up, the firewood was stacked, and the food was safely stashed in the metal locker provided at the site. We spent the next few hours exploring the area, walking along trails that wound past wildflowers and moss-covered rocks. The forest was alive with the hum of insects and the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. As the sun dipped lower, we returned to camp and built a fire. Flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the trees. The smell of smoke and roasting marshmallows filled the air. "Okay, Tina," Jamie said, passing me a skewer. "Time to prove your s'mores skills." "I was born for this," I said, carefully assembling a perfect marshmallow chocolate graham cracker sandwich. Mike shook his head. "She's too cocky. Bet she burns the next one." "Never," I said, holding up my flawless creation for them to admire. We laughed and talked as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. The woods felt alive yet peaceful, a world separate from the chaos of our normal lives. But as the fire died down and the conversation turned quieter, I became aware of the darkness beyond the circle of light. The forest seemed to press closer, its edges dissolving into shadow. "Do you guys ever think about what's out there?" I asked, staring into the trees. Jamie raised an eyebrow. "Like Bigfoot?" "Not Bigfoot, just animals or people." Mike chuckled. "We're in a national park, not a horror movie. The scariest thing you'll see out here is a raccoon trying to steal your snacks." "Don't jinx it," Jamie said, throwing a small stick at him. "Anyway, it's late. I'm calling it a night." We doused the fire and retreated to our tents. The night air was cool, and the ground was hard beneath my sleeping bag, but I felt content as I drifted off to the sound of crickets and the distant rush of water. Sometime later, I woke to a noise. It was faint at first, a series of low snaps and crunches like someone, or something, moving through the underbrush. I lay still, my heart pounding, straining to hear more. Probably just a deer, I whispered to myself, but the sound didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to be getting closer. I reached for my flashlight, hesitating before clicking it on. When I did, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing only the nylon walls of my tent and the faint outline of trees beyond. The noises stopped. "Hello?" I called softly, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded too loud, too vulnerable in the stillness. There was no response. After a long moment, the night seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, though it took a long time for sleep to come again. The thought lingered as I finally drifted off. Something was out there. The first light of dawn filtered through the forest, painting the campsite in muted shades of gold and green. The fire pit was cold, and the air carried the sharp chill of early morning. I woke with a start, my dreams of snapping branches and rustling leaves dissolving as I blinked up at the tent ceiling. I groaned and rolled over. "Jamie? Mike?" My voice cracked from sleep, but there was no answer. Their tent was zipped shut, its fabric sagging slightly in the morning dew. My stomach churned, but it wasn't from hunger. The unease from the night before still lingered, like the ghost of a bad memory. After a few moments of indecision, I grabbed my coat and stepped out of the tent, shivering as the cool air bit through my pajamas. The outhouse was a short walk from the campsite, a squat wooden building surrounded by trees. It wasn't exactly appealing, but I wasn't about to spend the weekend squatting behind a bush. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left near the tent door. It was dim now, the batteries nearly dead, and made my way down the trail. The forest was quiet, unnervingly so. No birds chirped, and even the ever-present hum of insects seemed muted. My footsteps crunched on the gravel path, the sound too loud in the stillness. I quickened my pace. The outhouse loomed ahead, a small wooden structure that smelled as awful as you'd expect. I wrinkled my nose and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges and I stepped inside, setting the flashlight on a small shelf by the door. "Get this over with," I muttered to myself, sitting on the cold wooden seat. That's when I heard it. A low, heavy rustling, like something large moving through the underbrush just beyond the outhouse. My muscles tensed and I held my breath, listening. It wasn't just the wind. Whatever was out there, it was big. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe an elk. They were common enough in the park, and they weren't dangerous. But the rustling grew louder, closer, accompanied by the unmistakable crunch of something heavy stepping on fallen leaves. I peered out through the narrow slit of the vent in the outhouse door. At first I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, something moved. A large, dark shape lumbering into view. It was a bear. Its black fur shimmered in the morning light as it sniffed the air, its nose twitching. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The bear was massive, easily 300 pounds, its powerful shoulders rippling with muscle as it moved. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid that even the smallest sound would draw its attention. But the bear didn't seem to notice me. It sniffed around the base of a tree, then turned toward the outhouse. "No, no, no," I whispered, panic surging through me. The bear's head swung in my direction, its small, dark eyes locking onto the outhouse. My pulse thundered in my ears as it took a slow, deliberate step closer. It was curious, I realized, maybe drawn by the scent of human activity. Or worse, by me. I reached for the flashlight on the shelf, my fingers trembling. I didn't know if the light would scare it off or make things worse, but I had to do something. As my hand closed around the flashlight, the bear reached the outhouse door. Its nose pressed against the wood, and it let out a low, rumbling huff that vibrated through the tiny room. I bit my lip to stifle a whimper. The bear pushed against the door, and I felt it flex inward slightly. My stomach dropped. The door was held closed by a simple latch, and I wasn't sure it would hold if the bear decided to test its strength. "Go away," I whispered, barely audible. My voice sounded pathetically small, lost in the space between me and the massive animal outside. The bear seemed to hear me. It tilted its head, sniffed again, then pawed at the ground. Its claws scraped against the dirt with a sound that made my skin crawl. I flicked the flashlight on and pointed it at the door. The beam of light spilled through the vent, illuminating the bear's face. It blinked and huffed, shaking its head slightly, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it stood up on its hind legs, its full height towering over the outhouse. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My fingers tightened around the flashlight as I stared in mute terror at the shadow of the bear through the vent. It swiped at the door, its claws scraping against the wood, leaving deep gouges. "Help!" I finally managed to choke out, my voice rising in panic. "Someone! Help!" The bear dropped back onto all fours with a heavy thud. It sniffed the door again, then stepped back slightly, as if considering its next move. My heart pounded as I scrambled to think of a plan. The ranger's pamphlet had said to make noise, to seem big and intimidating. But I couldn't seem big when I was trapped in a box, and making noise felt like inviting disaster. I banged the flashlight against the wall, the sound sharp and jarring in the confined space. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Go away!" The bear flinched, its ears flicking back, but it didn't leave. Instead, it let out a loud, guttural growl that made the walls of the outhouse vibrate. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes as I realized how hopelessly outmatched I was. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear stepped back. It turned its head, its ears swiveling as if listening to something in the distance. A moment later, it lumbered off into the woods, its massive form melting into the shadows. I sat frozen for a long moment, my body trembling as adrenaline coursed through me. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves as the bear disappeared. When I finally opened the door, my legs felt like jelly. The fresh air hit me like a slap, and I staggered a few steps before collapsing onto the ground. Jamie and Mike found me there minutes later, my face pale and streaked with tears. "What happened?" Jamie asked, dropping to her knees beside me. A bear," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. It was right there." Mike's eyes widened and he scanned the area. "Are you hurt?" "No, I gestured vaguely toward the outhouse. It tried to get in. I think I scared it off." Jamie squeezed my arm. "You're okay. You're safe now." I wasn't sure I believed her. The bear might have walked away, but its presence lingered, an oppressive shadow pressing on my chest. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Back at the campsite, Jamie and Mike sat with me at the picnic table. My hands were wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, but the warmth didn't chase away the chill that had settled deep in my chest. "Let me get this straight," Mike said, his voice skeptical. "You're saying the bear followed you to the outhouse, stood up against the door, and then just left?" "Yes," I snapped, too rattled to care about his tone. "It didn't just leave. I scared it off." Jamie frowned, leaning forward. "You sure it wasn't just curious? Bears around here aren't usually aggressive unless they're starving or threatened." I met her gaze, frustration bubbling under my skin. "It clawed the door." "Jamie," it growled, "that doesn't sound curious to me." Mike held up his hands. Okay, let's not panic. It's gone now, right? We're safe." His attempt at reassurance fell flat. The gashes in the outhouse door, long and deep, were burned into my memory. I knew what I saw, and I knew the bear wasn't just passing through. Jamie sighed and turned to Mike. "We should let the ranger know. Maybe they can check the area or something." Mike nodded reluctantly. "Fine. I'll head back to the station in a bit. Meanwhile, we'll stick close to camp. No wandering off alone." I didn't argue. The thought of leaving the relative safety of the campsite made my stomach churn. The morning passed in a haze. Jamie busied herself cleaning up the fire pit while Mike disappeared to talk to the ranger. I stayed at the table trying to focus on a book I'd brought, but the words blurred together on the page. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, made my pulse spike. Around noon, Mike returned, looking annoyed. "Ranger said they'd send someone out to check for signs of bear activity, but they're stretched thin this weekend. Apparently, they can't do much unless the bear actually attacks someone." "That's comforting," I muttered, my fingers tightening around the book. "They did say to keep following the safety protocols," Mike continued. "Food in the locker, no trash lying around, make noise if you see one." Like I didn't know that already, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I followed the rules and it still came after me. Jamie put a hand on my arm. Hey, let's not jump down each other's throats, we're all on edge. I took a deep breath, nodding. Sorry, I can't stop thinking about it. We'll be fine, she said, her voice steady. We'll stay together. Keep the fire going tonight. Bears don't like fire. Her calm tone helped, but only a little. The shadows under the trees seemed darker now. The woods heavier with an unseen presence. By mid-afternoon, I was beginning to relax, or at least convincing myself to. The three of us sat around the campsite, chatting about work and life back in Nashville. The normalcy was comforting, even if it felt fragile. Then I heard it. A soft rustling barely audible over our conversation. My head snapped toward the tree line, my breath catching in my throat. At first I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved, a subtle shift that made my stomach clench. Did you hear that? I whispered. Jamie frowned, following my gaze. Hear what? Something's out there. Mike sighed. It's probably a squirrel or a raccoon, relax. But I couldn't relax. I stood, my eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. The rustling grew louder, and then a shape emerged. A bear, the same one from this morning. I was sure of it. Oh my God, Jamie breathed, standing slowly. The bear was bigger than it had seemed earlier, its black fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. It sniffed the air, its nose twitching, and took a step closer. What do we do? I hissed, panic rising in my chest. Stay calm, Mike said, his voice low. Make noise, but don't run. He grabbed a pot from the table and banged it with a spoon, the metallic clang echoing through the clearing. Go on, get out of here. The bear flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, it growled, a low rumbling sound that made my knees weak. It's not working, I said, my voice trembling. Jamie grabbed a second pot and joined in, shouting and banging. The bear hesitated, then rose onto its hind legs. It was enormous, towering over us, its black eyes fixed on our group. Mike swore under his breath. Okay, this isn't normal. What do we do? I asked again, my voice breaking. The bear dropped back onto all fours, its gaze shifting toward me. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. It's targeting you, Jamie whispered. I took a shaky step back, my legs quivering. The bear advanced, slow and deliberate. Get in the car, Mike shouted suddenly. Now! The words jolted me into action. I turned and bolted toward the parking lot, Jamie and Mike close behind. The bear growled again, louder this time, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was following us. Go, 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 Jamie yelled, fumbling with the keys as we reached the car. She yanked the door open, and we scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of our heavy breathing. Then the bear appeared at the edge of the lot. It stared at the car, its head tilted slightly as if considering its next move. Is it going to attack the car? I whispered. Mike shook his head. I don't think so, it's just watching. The bear stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally turning and lumbering back into the woods. My muscles went slack and I slumped against the seat, my heart still racing. What the hell was that? Jamie said, her voice shaking. That wasn't normal. It was stalking us. I nodded, unable to speak. My mind replayed the encounter, the bear's unyielding gaze, the way it seemed to single me out. This wasn't just a random encounter, it felt personal. We can't stay here, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Not after that. Jamie and Mike exchanged a look, their expressions grim. We'll figure it out, Mike said. But first, let's get some distance. As Jamie started the car and drove us back toward the ranger station, I stared out the window, the forest blurring past. The bear was gone, but its presence lingered, a shadow in the back of my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. We sat in the parking lot near the ranger station, the car's engine idling as Jamie and Mike argued in the front seat. The air inside was tense, suffused with adrenaline and frustration. I'm telling you, we need to leave, Jamie said, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. That bear's not acting normal. Mike turned to her, his jaw tight. And what do you think the ranger's gonna say? We already talked to them this morning. Keep your food locked up and don't provoke it. Same story every time. I sat in the back seat staring out the window. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching across the asphalt. The bear's image burned in my mind. Its towering frame, the deep growl that seemed to vibrate through my bones. My leg bounced with nervous energy as I spoke up. We can't just sit here, it knows where we are. It followed me to the outhouse and it came back to the campsite. What if it comes here next? Jamie shot me a look in the rearview mirror. She's right. We need to report this again at least. Make them do something. Mike sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. Fine, but after that we're packing up and heading out. Agreed? We all nodded, and Jamie turned off the engine. The three of us climbed out, the gravel crunching under our boots as we approached the ranger station. The small wooden building looked welcoming in the daylight, but my stomach churned as we stepped inside. Behind the counter, a young ranger with a clipboard looked up, her expression polite but weary. Her name tag read, Ranger Keene. "Can I help you folks?" she asked, her southern drawl soft but firm. Jamie leaned forward on the counter, her voice urgent. "We reported bear activity this morning, but it's getting worse. The same bear showed up at our campsite and it didn't scare off when we tried making noise. It's stalking us." Ranger Keene frowned, jotting something down on her clipboard. "What campsite are you at?" 27, Jamie said. "It followed us all the way to the parking lot before turning back. Did it make physical contact with anyone or destroy any property?" Keene asked. "No," Mike said, crossing his arms, "but it came pretty damn close." The ranger sighed, setting the clipboard down. "Unfortunately, unless the bear actually harms someone or causes significant damage, we can't take aggressive action. It's likely a food-conditioned bear, probably smelled something at your site. If you're uncomfortable staying, we can refund your permit." I stared at her in disbelief. "That's it? A refund?" Ranger Keene's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "I understand this is upsetting, but this is normal behavior for a bear that's gotten too used to humans. My advice? Pack up, head to a different part of the park, or leave altogether." Jamie opened her mouth to argue, but Mike put a hand on her shoulder. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice low. Back at the campsite, the silence was oppressive. We worked quickly, packing our gear into bags and loading it into the car. Every noise, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me flinch. "Keep an eye out," Jamie said, her voice tight. She glanced over her shoulder toward the tree line. "If that thing shows up again..." "It won't," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. "It's probably long gone by now." I didn't believe him, and neither did Jamie. The three of us worked as fast as we could, our movements jerky and frantic. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing tighter with each passing second. I had just zipped up my backpack when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls. My head snapped up, and my blood ran cold. "Guys," I whispered, my voice shaking, "it's back." The bear emerged from the shadows like a nightmare come to life. Its massive body moved with deliberate, predatory grace, its black eyes locked on us. It sniffed the air, growling low in its throat. "Get to the car," Jamie hissed, grabbing my arm. "Now!" We bolted. The bear roared, the sound splitting the air like thunder. I felt the ground tremble beneath its weight as it charged after us. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as we sprinted toward the parking lot. "Don't look back," Jamie yelled, but I did. The bear was gaining on us, its powerful legs churning up dirt and leaves. It was too fast, too close. When we reached the car, Mike threw open the back door and shoved me inside. Jamie scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the door as the bear skidded to a stop just feet away. Its claws scraped against the pavement as it snarled, its teeth bared. "Go, go, go!" I screamed. Jamie jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, and she hit the gas, the car lurching forward. The bear chased us for a few strides before slowing, its growls fading into the distance as we sped away. We didn't stop driving until we were miles from the park, the dense forest giving way to open roads and scattered houses. Jamie finally pulled over at a gas station, and we sat in silence, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Mike broke the silence. What the hell was that? I shook my head, my hands trembling in my lap. It wasn't just curious. That thing was hunting us. Jamie leaned back in her seat, her face pale. We should have left sooner. I knew we should have left. What matters is we're out now, Mike said, his tone flat. We're safe. But were we? I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was still out there, its presence lingering like a shadow in the back of my mind. Even as we left the park far behind, I knew the memory of its black eyes and snarling face would follow me for the rest of my life. Jamie turned to me, her voice soft but firm. You okay? I nodded, though it was a lie. My leg still ached from the earlier wound, and my mind replayed the encounter on an endless loop. I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe again. Let's just go home, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this anymore. Jamie nodded and started the car, her hands tight on the wheel. As we pulled back onto the road, I stared out the window at the trees, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The bear was gone, but the fear it left behind was something I'd carry with me forever. The cabin of the car felt stifling, despite the air conditioning blasting on full. The bear might have been behind us, but its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. None of us spoke for a long time as Jamie drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. I stared out the window, the dense forest rolling past in a blur. My leg throbbed where the bear's claws had scraped me earlier, a burning reminder of how close I'd come to something far worse. I pressed the jacket harder against the wound, wincing as fresh pain flared up. You okay back there? Jamie asked, breaking the silence. Not really, I muttered. My leg's killing me. Mike turned to look at me, his brows furrowed. We should stop and clean that. You're gonna need stitches. I didn't respond. The thought of stopping, of being outside the relative safety of the car, made my stomach twist. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bear was still out there watching us somehow. Jamie glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Tina, we need to take care of that. There's a rest stop up ahead. We can stop there. I hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Fine. Just make it quick. The rest stop was little more than a wide gravel lot with a single picnic table and a bathroom building that looked older than all of us combined. Jamie parked the car as close to the building as she could, and we all got out, our movements stiff and wary. Here, Mike said, grabbing the first aid kit from the trunk. Let's take a look. I sat on the edge of the picnic table, pulling up my jeans to reveal the angry gash on my thigh. The sight made my stomach churn. 3 long, jagged lines ran down my leg, crusted with dried blood and oozing faintly. Jesus, Jamie muttered, her face pale. That looks bad. Mike knelt in front of me, his face grim as he cleaned the wound with antiseptic wipes. The sting was unbearable, and I clenched my teeth, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. You're gonna need stitches for sure, he said, wrapping a bandage tightly around my leg. This is just temporary. Great, I muttered. Add that to the list of things to deal with. Jamie looked around nervously, her eyes darting to the tree line. Let's not stay here any longer than we have to. Mike nodded, packing up the first aid kit. Agreed. Let's get to a hospital. We piled back into the car, but as Jamie turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. You've got to be kidding me, she said, trying again. The car gave a weak groan but refused to start. Mike swore under his breath. What's wrong with it? Jamie shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. I don't know. It was fine a minute ago. I leaned forward from the back seat, my chest tightening. Please tell me you can fix it. Mike popped the hood and got out to check, muttering curses under his breath. Jamie and I stayed in the car, the silence thick with tension. Every creak of the trees and every whisper of wind sounded like footsteps to me. Finally, Mike slammed the hood shut and climbed back in. It's the battery. It's dead. Jamie groaned, slumping against the steering wheel. Fantastic. What now? There's no cell service out here, Mike said. We're gonna have to wait for someone to come by. The weight of his words sank in, and I felt a rising wave of panic. Wait here? Are you serious? What if the bear comes back? Jamie turned to face me, her expression calm but firm. We don't have a choice, Tina. We can't walk anywhere with your leg like that, and we can't leave the car. It's safer to stay put. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right. Still, the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere, with that bear possibly nearby, was almost too much to bear. The hours dragged on. We locked the doors and stayed in the car, peering out at the woods like prisoners in our own little cage. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lot. My leg throbbed steadily, a relentless reminder of how vulnerable we were. Jamie broke the silence. "Do you think it's still out there?" Mike shook his head. "Probably not. Bears don't usually stick around once people are gone." I wasn't so sure. The bear's behavior had been anything but usual. It had followed us, persisted even when we made noise. It wasn't just curious, it was deliberate. "I don't know," I said quietly. "It felt like it was hunting us." Jamie glanced at me, her expression troubled. "Don't say that." "It's true," I insisted. "It wasn't acting normal, it was—" A loud rustling interrupted me, coming from the woods just beyond the rest stop. We all froze, staring out the windows. "Did you hear that?" Jamie whispered. Mike grabbed the flashlight from the center console, clicking it on. He shone the beam toward the trees, the light cutting through the gathering darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but shadows. Then a shape moved. The bear stepped into the clearing, its massive body lit by the fading sunlight. It sniffed the air, its black eyes locking onto the car. "Oh my God," Jamie breathed, her voice trembling. The bear advanced slowly, its movements deliberate and menacing. It wasn't in a hurry. It knew we couldn't go anywhere. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Stay quiet," Mike said. "Don't move." The bear circled the car, its nose pressed against the windows. Its breath fogged the glass, leaving streaks as it moved. I could feel its presence, massive and oppressive, pressing in on all sides. "It's testing us," Jamie said, her voice barely audible. The bear swiped at the car door, the sound of its claws scraping metal sending shivers down my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would leave. After what felt like an eternity, the bear stopped. It sniffed the air one last time, then turned and lumbered back into the woods. The silence it left behind was deafening. Jamie exhaled shakily, her hands trembling on the wheel. "Is it gone?" Mike nodded, though he looked as shaken as the rest of us. "For now." I leaned back against the seat, my entire body trembling. The bear might have left, but the fear remained as deep and unrelenting as the ache in my leg. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice hoarse. "We have to find a way to leave." Jamie met my gaze in the rearview mirror, her expression grim. "We will, but for now, we wait." And so we did. Huddled in the car as the night pressed in, the shadows outside growing deeper and darker. The bear's departure left an eerie silence in its wake, but the oppressive sense of vulnerability lingered. The sun had fully set, plunging the rest stop into darkness, with only the weak beam of Mike's flashlight and the faint glow of the car's hazard lights piercing the gloom. "We can't stay here all night," Jamie said, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled but was steady enough to carry conviction. "We need to find help." Mike frowned, his jaw tight as he stared out into the dark woods. "And how do you propose we do that? Walk down the highway with no light? What if it comes back?" I leaned against the car door, my leg throbbing from the earlier injury. The bandage Mike had wrapped was holding, but I could feel the blood seeping through. "We can't just wait here. What if no one comes by? My leg—" I paused, swallowing hard. "I need stitches. Infection's going to be an issue soon." Jamie tapped the steering wheel nervously. "We're not that far from the ranger station, maybe a couple of miles. We could walk back there." "In the dark?" Mike asked. "With a bear out there somewhere? Do you have a better idea?" Jamie snapped. "Because sitting here is just waiting to be trapped again." Mike ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Fine, we walk. But we stick together and we keep quiet." Jamie nodded. "Agreed. I can't walk far," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "Not like this." "You won't have to," Mike said. "We'll take it slow, and if you can't go on, we'll figure something out." The three of us stepped out of the car, every nerve in my body screaming that this was a bad idea. The woods were alive with sounds, the chirp of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, but the oppressive sense of being watched lingered. Mike took the lead, holding the flashlight. Jamie stayed close behind me, her arm steadying me as I hobbled along, my injured leg dragging slightly. Each step sent jolts of pain up my thigh, but I gritted my teeth and pushed forward. "Stay close," Mike whispered, the beam of the flashlight bouncing over the gravel. "And keep an eye on the trees." The highway was eerily quiet, the only light coming from the stars overhead and Mike's flashlight. We moved slowly, each of us hyper-aware of the sounds around us. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me flinch, my heart racing as I glanced over my shoulder. "Do you hear that?" Jamie whispered, her grip on my arm tightening. We all stopped, holding our breath. The sound was faint at first, a soft, deliberate rustling coming from the woods to our left. It grew louder, closer, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. "Keep moving," Mike said, his voice low but firm. "Don't stop." I tried to pick up the pace, but my injured leg refused to cooperate. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the heavy crunch of twigs snapping underfoot. "It's following us," I whispered, panic clawing at my chest. "Stay calm," Jamie said, though her voice wavered. "It might not be the bear." "What else could it be?" I hissed. Mike stopped abruptly and turned, shining the flashlight toward the woods. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense undergrowth. For a moment there was nothing. Then a pair of glowing eyes reflected the light. "It's the bear," Mike said, his voice tight. The bear stepped into the light, its massive body moving with a deliberate, predatory grace. It was closer than I expected, no more than 20 yards away. My stomach dropped, and my legs felt like jelly. "Run," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Jamie pulled me forward as Mike swung the flashlight wildly, trying to disorient the bear. We stumbled down the highway, my injured leg slowing us down as the bear let out a deep, guttural growl. It was a sound that seemed to reverberate through my entire body, primal and terrifying. "I can't," I gasped, my breath coming in ragged bursts. "I can't go any faster." "You don't have to," Jamie said, her voice strained. "Just keep moving." The bear was gaining on us. I could hear its heavy footfalls on the pavement, the sound sending waves of panic through me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Mike stopped suddenly, turning to face the bear. He grabbed a rock from the side of the road and hurled it at the animal. The rock struck its shoulder with a dull thud, and the bear let out a furious roar. "Go," Mike shouted. "I'll distract it." "No!" Jamie yelled, dragging me forward. "We stay together." The bear charged, its powerful body covering the distance between us in seconds. I stumbled, falling hard onto the pavement as pain shot through my leg. Jamie crouched beside me, her arm wrapping around my shoulders. "Get up," she shouted. "We have to go." Mike swung his flashlight at the bear, the beam of light flickering as it struck the animal's side. The bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over him as it let out a deafening roar. "Run!" Mike yelled again. Jamie pulled me to my feet, and we stumbled forward, my injured leg barely holding me up. I glanced back to see Mike retreating slowly, his flashlight still trained on the bear. "Come on," Jamie shouted, her voice desperate. Mike finally turned and ran, the bear dropping back onto all fours to chase him. It didn't follow us. It was locked onto him, its movements calculated and relentless. We reached a bend in the highway, the faint glow of the ranger station's lights visible in the distance. My entire body was trembling, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Mike!" Jamie yelled, her voice cracking with emotion. "Mike, where are you?" There was no answer, only the distant sounds of the bear's growls and heavy footfalls fading into the woods. Jamie turned to me, her face pale and stricken. "We can't leave him." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "He told us to run. We have to keep going." Jamie hesitated, her eyes darting back toward the woods. Then she nodded reluctantly. "Let's get to the station. We'll send help." When we finally stumbled into the ranger station, I collapsed onto a bench, my injured leg giving out beneath me. Jamie banged on the counter, shouting for help. Ranger Keene appeared, her expression alarmed. "What happened?" "There's a bear," Jamie said, her words tumbling over each other. It attacked us. Our friend, he's still out there. Keen grabbed her radio, her face grim. I'll call a search team. As the ranger made the call, Jamie sat beside me, her hands shaking. We shouldn't have left him. I didn't respond. The guilt was a crushing weight on my chest, but I knew we'd had no choice. We'd done what we had to do to survive. The bear was gone, at least for now. But the fear, the helplessness, and the memory of Mike standing between us and the beast would haunt me forever. The ranger station was bustling with activity by the time dawn broke, the dim light filtering through the thick haze of tension that hung in the air. Jamie and I sat on a wooden bench near the entrance, numb and exhausted. My leg throbbed with a dull, relentless pain beneath the makeshift bandage, but I barely noticed it over the heavy weight of guilt and fear pressing down on me. Ranger Keen approached, her clipboard in hand and a grim expression on her face. Behind her, 2 other rangers were gearing up with tranquilizer rifles and tracking equipment. "We've sent a team out to search for your friend," she said, her tone professional but distant. "They'll follow the trail where you last saw him and look for any sign of the bear." Jamie clenched her fists in her lap, her knuckles white. "He was trying to distract it so we could get away. He saved us." Keen nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I understand. We'll do everything we can to find him, but I need to get a statement from both of you while it's still fresh." Jamie nodded quickly, eager to cooperate, but I hesitated. What could I even say? That we'd been hunted by a bear that seemed unnaturally persistent? That Mike had stood between us and the animal with nothing but a flashlight? "Tina?" Jamie prompted gently. "You okay to talk?" I swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah, I can do this." We followed Keen into a small room with a table and 2 chairs, the walls adorned with maps of the park and faded wildlife safety posters. Jamie and I sat across from her and she clicked her pen, ready to write. "Start from the beginning," she said. "What happened after you left your campsite?" Jamie took the lead, recounting the events in a halting, shaky voice. She described how we'd tried to hike back to the ranger station after the car broke down, how the bear had followed us and how Mike had stayed behind to distract it. Keen listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When Jamie finished, she turned to me. "Is there anything you want to add?" I took a deep breath, my hands trembling in my lap. The bear, it didn't act normal. It wasn't just curious or startled. It felt like it was targeting us, like it wanted us gone. Keen frowned slightly, tilting her head. Bears don't typically exhibit that kind of behavior unless they've been food conditioned or feel threatened. "It didn't feel like that," I said, my voice rising slightly. "It followed us for miles. It wasn't afraid of us, no matter how much noise we made. It didn't stop until Mike distracted it." Keen's pen paused on the paper, and she regarded me with a mix of concern and skepticism. "I'll make a note of that, but without any concrete evidence, it's difficult to determine why the bear acted the way it did." "So that's it?" Jamie asked, her voice sharp. "You're just going to write it down and move on?" "I understand this is upsetting," Keen said, her tone calm but firm. "But unless we find the bear and confirm it's the same one responsible for these behaviors, there's not much more we can do." Hours passed as we waited in the ranger station, the tension between Jamie and me growing thicker with each minute. She paced the room, her movements restless, while I sat in a stiff chair near the window staring out at the forest. Finally, one of the rangers returned, his expression grim. Jamie rushed to meet him, her voice frantic. "Did you find him? Did you find Mike?" The ranger shook his head slowly. "We found signs of a struggle. Some broken branches, a few drops of blood, but no sign of Mike or the bear." Jamie's face crumpled and she sank into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. I felt hollow, the weight of the news pressing down on me like a physical force. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The ranger exchanged a glance with Keen. "We'll keep searching, but with the size of the park and the bear's mobility, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack." "So that's it," Jamie said bitterly, her voice muffled by her hands. "You're just going to stop looking eventually?" Keen stepped forward, her expression solemn. "We won't stop, but you need to understand the reality of the situation. These mountains are vast and bears are unpredictable. We'll do our best. Jamie didn't respond, and I turned back to the window, my throat tight. The guilt gnawed at me, relentless and sharp. We had left Mike behind. We hadn't had a choice, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. By the time we left the ranger station, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the parking lot. A tow truck had arrived to jumpstart our car, and the ranger station staff insisted on calling ahead to the nearest hospital to ensure my leg was treated. Jamie sat silently in the driver's seat as we pulled away, her face pale and drawn. I sat in the passenger seat, staring at the road ahead but not really seeing it. "We shouldn't have left him," Jamie said finally, her voice trembling. "We should have stayed and fought." I shook my head, my voice hoarse. We wouldn't have survived, he knew that. That's why he did it." Jamie gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "I should have done more. I should have—" "There was nothing we could do," I interrupted, my voice breaking. "You know that, Jamie. He saved us. We can't change that." She didn't respond, and the silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The hospital was quiet when we arrived, the fluorescent lights harsh against the sterile white walls. A nurse led me into a treatment room, her expression professional but kind. "You've had a rough time," she said as she cleaned the wound on my leg. "This is going to need stitches, but it should heal fine as long as there's no infection." I nodded, barely listening. The pain felt distant, overshadowed by the gnawing ache in my chest. After the stitches were in place, the nurse handed me a prescription for antibiotics and a pamphlet about wound care. "You'll want to follow up with your primary care doctor in a few days." "Thanks," I said quietly, slipping the papers into my bag. Jamie waited for me in the lobby, her face drawn and her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't say anything as we left the hospital and climbed back into the car. The drive back to Nashville was long and silent, each mile stretching the distance between us and the nightmare we'd left behind. But no matter how far we drove, the memories clung to me, sharp and unrelenting. The bear was gone, and so was Mike. But the scars it left, on my body, on our lives, were something we'd carry forever. Back in Nashville, life was supposed to return to normal. That's what everyone told me. My leg, stitched and bandaged, was healing well enough. The wound itched constantly, a maddening reminder of what had happened. But the scars that didn't show, the ones that lived in my mind, were another matter entirely. The first night back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes made me think of the bear. I sat in bed, staring at the locked window, half expecting to see its shadow in the streetlight outside. The next morning, Jamie called. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice strained. I hesitated. "Fine, I guess. You?" "Not great," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him. I see Mike." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. I hadn't said his name aloud since we left the Smokies, as if avoiding it would make the guilt easier to bear. "I know," I said softly. "Me too," Jamie sighed. "I can't stop thinking about what the Rangers said, that they'd keep searching, but we both know what that means. They're not going to find him, are they?" I didn't answer right away. The truth hung heavy between us. "No," I said finally. "They won't." Work at the coffee shop was a blur. Customers came and went, their voices blending into a dull hum that filled the space but couldn't drown out my thoughts. I tried to focus on the routine, making lattes, ringing up orders, but my hands trembled every time I poured a cup. One afternoon, a regular customer, an older man named Frank, noticed my limp. "What happened to your leg?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. I froze for a moment, the answer catching in my throat. "Camping accident," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Slipped and cut myself." "Ah, gotta be careful out there," he said with a chuckle. "Nature doesn't mess around." "No," I said quietly. "It doesn't." Jamie and I met up for drinks a week later at a dimly lit bar near her apartment. She looked as tired as I felt, her face pale and drawn. "I had a dream about him last night," she said after a long silence, swirling her drink. "Mike, he was standing in the woods, just staring at me." I shuddered. "I keep hearing the bear." In my dreams, in the quiet, that growl, I can't get it out of my head. Jamie nodded, her fingers tightening around her glass. Do you think anyone actually believes us? About how the bear acted? No, I said bluntly. The rangers didn't, the hospital staff didn't. Even the people we've told since we got back, they just nod and say, "That's crazy." Like it's some campfire story. Jamie sighed. It feels like it didn't even happen, you know? Like Mike's just gone, and the world keeps turning like he was never here. I didn't have an answer for that. I just clinked my glass against hers in a silent toast, though neither of us drank after. A local news station picked up the story a few days later, but it was just a short segment buried between weather updates and sports scores. Local man missing after bear encounter in Smokies. The headline read, "They didn't mention my injury or Jamie's and my escape." They certainly didn't mention the terror of being hunted. The reporter's voice was clinical as she read the statement from the Park Service. Search efforts are ongoing, but officials remind visitors to exercise caution when exploring wilderness areas and to follow all bear safety guidelines. Jamie texted me as soon as it aired. That's it? That's all they're saying? I stared at my phone for a long time before replying. Yeah, that's all. Weeks passed, and the wound on my leg began to heal, leaving behind 3 jagged scars. I caught myself staring at them sometimes, tracing the uneven lines with my fingers. They felt like proof that it had all been real, that the bear had been there, that Mike had been there, but the world around me moved on. Friends and coworkers stopped asking about my trip. Jamie and I drifted into an unspoken agreement not to talk about the Smokies unless one of us brought it up first. The nightmares, though, stayed. Almost every night I found myself back in the woods, the bear's growl echoing through the trees. I'd wake up gasping, my heart pounding, and spend the rest of the night staring at the ceiling. One day I decided to visit Mike's parents. Jamie couldn't bring herself to come, so I went alone, clutching a bouquet of white lilies as I rang the doorbell. His mother answered, her face lighting up in recognition before clouding with sadness. "Tina," she said, her voice soft. "Come in." Their home was filled with photos of Mike, smiling at family gatherings, posing in front of landmarks, caught mid-laugh with friends. I couldn't look at them for long. "We just wanted to thank you," his father said as we sat in the living room. "For being there with him. For trying to help." I didn't know how to respond. Guilt clawed at me, sharp and unrelenting. "I'm so sorry," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I wish we could have done more." His mother reached over, taking my hand. "You did what you could. You're here, and that means he made sure you survived. That's what matters." Her words offered no comfort, but I nodded anyway. Months later, I went for a walk in a local park. The air was crisp, the trees bare as winter began to settle in. I avoided the wooded trails, sticking to the open paths where I could see everything around me. As I sat on a bench near a small pond, a family walked by, their young son clutching a stuffed bear. He was laughing, running ahead of his parents, the toy swinging in his hand. I stared at the bear. Its soft, harmless face, a cruel parody of the creature that had haunted my dreams. My scars itched beneath my jeans, a phantom reminder of what I'd endured. "Tina," a voice said, and I looked up to see Jamie standing there, bundled in a coat and scarf. "Jamie," I said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Needed some air," she said, sitting beside me. "You?" "Same." We sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks on the pond. "I think about him every day," Jamie said finally. "Mike, what he did for us." "Me too," I said. "I don't think that'll ever go away." She nodded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like acceptance in her eyes. Maybe it's not supposed to. We sat there until the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky streaked with shades of orange and pink. The bear was gone, but its shadow remained, a silent reminder of what we'd lost and what we'd survived.